Okay, let's unpack this. What if a major world leader just proposed that a neighbor, a close ally, should become like a state?
And they tied it directly to a massive defense project.
Exactly. That's, well, one of the truly eye-opening things we found in the stack of sources you shared for this deep dive. Welcome to the deep dive. We take your articles, your notes, reports, everything you've gathered, and we sort of cut through the noise. We pull out the most important bits, the key insights.
And today we're looking at global events from May 27th and 28th, 2025, trying to connect the dots you laid out.
Yeah, and what jumps out immediately looking at this material is just the sheer range, isn't it? High-level politics, policy shifts with global effects, even, local incidents with bigger lessons.
It really paints a picture of a world, well, kind of in flux.
Absolutely. So our mission here is to make sense of it all for you. Here's the plan for this deep dive. We'll start by digging into that fascinating tension point in North America, U.S. and Canada. Then we'll pivot, look at some surprising U.S. domestic policies your sources flagged, the ones having big international ripples.
Right.
And finally, we'll touch on a few other notable global incidents before, pulling some key threads together.
Sounds good.
So first up, North America. Your sources really highlight a period of real strain in U.S.-Canada relations, driven by some pretty provocative U.S. proposals and how Canada pushed back.
That 51st state proposal is definitely the most striking. Your sources describe former President Trump not just floating this idea for Canada,
Yeah.
but explicitly linking it to his Golden Dome anti-missile defense program.
Right, and the way he framed the cost, according to the details you gave us, is pretty remarkable. He apparently suggested it would cost Canada $0. $0.
If it became the dear 51st state, yeah.
But a whopping $61 billion to join in the defense program if it remained a separate but unequal nation. That phrase itself is something.
Mm-hmm. And he even claimed on social media, the source says, that Canada was considering this offer, which seems, well, unlikely given the reaction.
Considering the offer. Wow, okay. And this Golden Dome itself.
It's ambitious.
Yep.
Your sources describe it as a space-based missile intercept system, announced just before this, May 20th, with a huge estimated cost, $175 billion.
Yeah, it's supposed to be done in 3 years. That sounds incredibly fast.
Very fast. And your material points out these comments aren't happening in a vacuum, right?
No, there are ongoing trade disputes, like the 25% tariffs Trump put on Canadian imports back in March.
And Canada hit back with its own tariffs, most of which are apparently still in place. So there's already friction.
Right.
And the analysis within your sources, it calls this whole approach unprecedented and highly contentious. I mean, it directly challenges Canadian sovereignty.
It uses defense cooperation as leverage, basically.
Exactly. The source uses phrases like transactional and coercive approach, framing defense contributions like a direct payment.
Akin to a protection racket was one phrase used.
Yeah. Yes. And calling Canada separate but unequal. It really captures the perceived pressure here.
Okay, so this is happening between the U.S. and Canada. Why should you, listening elsewhere, care? What's the bigger picture?
Well, if this kind of transactional demand becomes, normalized,
Yeah.
your sources suggest it could really destabilize traditional security alliances. Think NATO, NORAD.
Because they're built on shared defense, not paying fees.
Precisely. They're built on common goals, mutual support, not quid pro quo financial deals. If allies start feeling they have to, pay for protection or make political concessions just for security,
It erodes trust.
yeah, it erodes trust, and it could lead to a more fragmented global security landscape. Less predictable, potentially more dangerous.
That makes sense. So, faced with this kind of pressure, how did Canada respond, according to your sources? It wasn't just a simple shrug, was it?
No, far from it. Your material details a multi-pronged response, clearly asserting its independence.
And that's where the King Charles III visit comes in, right? He gave the throne speech in the Canadian Parliament.
Which is a big deal. A reigning monarch hadn't done that since 1977, and it was King Charles's first time doing it as king in Canada.
And his words were pretty pointed.
They were. As quoted in your sources, he talked about Canada facing unprecedented challenges, but then strongly affirmed the true North is indeed strong and free, a clear signal about sovereignty.
And Prime Minister Mark Carney was even more direct. Your sources quote him saying Canada is not for sale.
Can't get much clearer than that.
So symbolism, yes, but were there concrete actions too?
Yes. Your sources highlight a significant move. Canada committed to joining Arm Europe.
What's that exactly?
It's described as a major arms procurement initiative. The goal is boosting weapons production within European countries.
Ah, so strengthening ties there.
Yeah.
And the source noted something interesting about the announcement.
Yes, that the King's speech announcing this conspicuously avoided mentioning military procurement from the U.S. A deliberate omission, it seems.
Interesting detail. And your sources also mention other points from that speech, like
Yeah.
defending the dairy industry.
Right, which has been a specific target of U.S. trade attacks. And also reinvesting in the Canadian Armed Forces. Perhaps a subtle nod to U.S. complaints about defense spending, but doing it on Canada's terms.
And there's a note that even the U.S. ambassador to Canada tried to sort of downplay the 51st state talk right before the king visited, maybe sensing the direction things were going.
Possibly. Your sources interpret all these Canadian actions together as a strategic pivot.
A pivot towards Europe.
It seems so. Actively shifting focus, diversifying defense, ties away from just the U.S. Leveraging Commonwealth connections, the King's visit is key symbolism there, and engaging with these European initiatives.
So the idea is to strengthen Canada's position, make it less vulnerable to U.S. pressure.
Exactly. The King's visit wasn't just ceremony. Your sources see it as a powerful, symbolic act of independence, a strategic move.
So for you, the listener, what's the key takeaway from this whole U.S.-Canada dynamic? What should you be watching?
Well, your sources suggest we might be seeing the potential for a real rebalancing, maybe even a weakening of the traditional U.S.-Canada security axis.
And if Canada leans more towards Europe,
It could signal to other U.S. allies, especially those feeling similar pressures, that there are other options, alternative partnerships, which could, contribute to a more multipolar world, less U.S.-centric maybe.
that leads us nicely into the next section, because your sources also dig into how U.S. domestic policy decisions are having pretty significant effects globally, especially around education and institutional autonomy.
Right. One major policy change detailed in your material involves student visas.
Okay, what happened there?
It describes the suspension of visa interview scheduling for foreign students and also introducing expanded social media screening for applicants.
Expanded screening, okay. And the State Department acknowledged this would cause problems.
Yes, according to your sources, they acknowledge it would have significant consequences globally for their own embassies and consulates, presumably workload, processing time.
And the reason given in your sources?
It's cited as part of a broader campaign by the Trump administration, targeting leading U.S. universities, accusing them of not doing enough to counter anti-Semitism. That's the connection made in the source.
Okay. So what are the implications people are worried about?
Well, looking at the analysis in your sources, there are concerns about privacy, obviously, with social media screening, potential for discrimination based on subjective assessments.
And the disruption to students.
Huge disruption to the flow of foreign students,
Yeah.
which hits U.S. universities hard. They rely on international students for revenue, yes, but also for the intellectual contributions they bring, the talent.
Right.
So your sources view this policy as potentially undermining a long-held U.S. advantage, attracting global talent, driving innovation. It puts that at risk.
Why should this matter to you listening perhaps outside the U.S.?
Well, your sources talk about the risk of a brain drain. Many other countries are actively trying to attract skilled immigrants, talented students.
So if the U.S. makes it harder.
Exactly. These kinds of policies, the increased screening, the general feeling of maybe protectionism, could push talented people towards other countries, which long-term could hurt U.S. economic dynamism, its global influence.
And connected to that is another really big item from your sources, the reported impact of reduced funding for Harvard University.
Yeah, this is described as an unprecedented and deeply impactful step. Really quite dramatic.
What are the specifics?
Your sources indicate the Trump administration is seeking to withdraw about $100 million in federal contracts and funding from Harvard.
$100 million, that's significant. And there was something even more drastic mentioned.
Yes, a potential measure. Revoking Harvard's right to enroll foreign students, which would force current international students there to either transfer immediately or lose their visa status. A huge upheaval.
Wow. And federal agencies are reviewing grants too.
Reportedly, yes. Reviewing existing grants with an eye towards terminating them.
And the reason given here, again,
It's directly linked in your sources to the administration's criticism that universities like Harvard aren't doing enough to combat anti-Semitism. That's the justification presented.
and your sources also mention NPR, the radio network, suing the administration over its own funding cuts.
Yes, presenting it as a related example, a pattern, perhaps, of using funding as a political tool. The NPR lawsuit alleges a First Amendment violation.
And it's noted in your sources that this Harvard funding story was actually breaking news on Time.com. Shows how significant it's perceived.
Definitely. Your sources interpret this whole thing as a clear sign of intent, an intent to exert political control over academic institutions.
Which threatens their independence.
Absolutely.
Right.
They emphasize the potential damage to Harvard, its research, its budget, its global reputation, but also the wider implications for the entire U.S. higher education sector.
Because if it can happen to Harvard.
Right. Linking funding and student enrollment directly to perceived political compliance. Your sources call that direct and aggressive political intervention, a threat to academic freedom, institutional autonomy.
So the big picture takeaway here for you, the listener.
Your sources frame this as a profound threat, not just to Harvard, but to the integrity and the global competitiveness of the entire U.S. higher education system.
A potential decline in quality, loss of talent.
Yes, if universities feel they're constantly under political scrutiny for funding, it could have a chilling effect. Plus, it raises significant constitutional questions about government overreach into academia. More legal battles seem likely, more polarization.
Okay, let's broaden our view now. Your sources also covered a few other significant global incidents around the same time, giving us a sense of the diverse range of things happening.
One really major incident was a chemical plant explosion in China.
Yes, tell us about that. It happened on May 27th.
That's right, at the Gaomi Yudao chemical plant in Shandong province. It produces pesticides, medical chemicals.
And the casualties were serious.
Very. Your sources reported at least 5 deaths, 19 injured, and 6 missing as of the next morning. Search and rescue was ongoing.
And the explosion itself was powerful.
Immense, apparently, breaking windows miles away. What's particularly noted in your sources is the plant's history.
Oh.
It had received safety risk notices twice in the last year. Twice. Yet somehow it was also praised for its risk management just last September.
Praised after getting risk notices. That seems contradictory.
It does. And this explosion happened less than 2 weeks after a national workshop focused specifically on preventing risks in the chemical industry.
Wow. Your sources also mentioned that workplace safety is a wider issue in China.
A persistent problem is the phrase used, citing tens of thousands of incidents and deaths just in 2024, and referencing previous major disasters like Tianjin in 2015 and Yancheng in 2019. It's an ongoing challenge.
So the analysis in your sources suggests
that this incident really underscores the difficulties in enforcing industrial safety standards in China, even when the government seems to be paying attention.
Questions about enforcement.
Or priorities?
Both, potentially. The contradiction, the praise versus the explosion, raises questions about how effective audits are. Is enforcement strong enough? Or are economic pressures maybe still overriding safety? Or, as the source hints, issues like weak oversight or even corruption could play a role.
And the impact here, for everyone listening.
Well, there's the obvious human cost, the environmental damage. But your sources also point to potential social unrest locally. And, importantly for international businesses, concerns about supply chain reliability and ethical sourcing. If safety conditions are inconsistent, that creates risk.
Right. Okay, another incident covered was in Liverpool, UK. A car driving into a crowd.
Yes, this happened May 26th on Water Street. It was during a parade for the Liverpool Football Club. They'd won the Premier League.
And people were injured.
Yes, quite a few. Your sources give slightly different numbers, but both indicate dozens were either hospitalized or treated at the scene, including children.
But crucially, the police were clear about one thing.
Very clear, yes. Your sources emphasize the statement from British police. This incident is not being treated as terrorism. That's important context.
Still, your sources frame it as part of a concerning trend.
Yes, a broader trend of vehicle ramming tragedies globally, regardless of the motive. And the fact that the vehicle managed to breach security barriers is highlighted as particularly worrying.
So the analysis here focuses on public safety at large events.
Exactly. It highlights how vulnerable these big gatherings can be to vehicle intrusions, even if the intent isn't malicious terrorism. The number of injuries shows the potential danger.
And the barrier breach is key.
It points to a need for constant review and strengthening of crowd safety measures. Perimeter security, traffic management, physical defenses, they need to be robust and adaptable.
So for you listening, this underscores what your sources call an acute need for dynamic public safety strategies, going beyond just counterterrorism.
Right. It means thinking about robust physical barriers, smart traffic planning around events, having rapid response protocols ready. Your sources also touch on the challenge for urban planners. How do you keep cities accessible while still putting in necessary security for crowded areas? It's a tough balance.
Definitely. Okay, your sources also included a list, kind of a rapid-fire overview of other notable events from these couple of days, just to give us that wider snapshot.
Yeah, real mix. We saw the election of Pope Leo XIV, Robert Prevost, the first American pope, seen potentially as a move to unite factions in the church.
Then there were reports of India and Pakistan engaging in drone battles, described as a dangerous new phase, even the first drone war, apparently affecting things like India's cricket league.
Namibia held its first National Memorial Day for the colonial genocide committed by German forces, acknowledging concentration camps, horrific experiments, a major historical reckoning.
Slovakia approved the sale of brown bear meat. That's despite their protected status, but it came after some recent bear attacks. Controversial, I imagine.
Likely so. Then the sad news of the death of South African actor Presley Tweniage, star of Tsotsi. Only 40 natural causes reported.
A real loss. Elsewhere, Norwegian Princess Ingrid Alexandra is reportedly moving to Australia for university.
And in Australian politics, the Liberal National Coalition apparently reunited after a split, reaching a policy agreement.
Kenya's president issued an apology to Tanzania over a deportation dispute. That came amidst some criticism at home.
Brazilian prosecutors are reportedly suing the Chinese company BYD, the electric vehicle maker, over allegations of slave labor conditions. That could have big implications.
In Turkey, President Erdogan appointed a legal team to draft a new constitution, raising concerns, the source notes, about potentially extending his rule.
A judge was reported stabbed in southern Iran. Just a brief mention, but stark.
On the business front, Salesforce is set to acquire Informatica, an $8 billion deal, roughly.
Your sources also reiterated that point about King Charles III, stating Canada faces unprecedented dangers. We covered the context earlier, but it was listed again.
There's a report. Former President Trump plans to pardon Todd and Julie Chrisley, the reality TV stars.
U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth visited Taiwan. Discussions on regional security, trade, always significant visits like that.
Your sources noted an interesting geopolitical shift. The fall of Assad in Syria apparently turning Turkey and Saudi Arabia from rivals into partners. That's a big change.
Indeed. The mayor of Rio de Janeiro eased some rules on live beach music after protests. A local issue with broader resonance, perhaps.
Thai and Cambodian soldiers briefly clashed in a disputed border area, a reminder of ongoing tensions.
Indonesian and French leaders met for talks on defense and trade.
An Australian whistleblower, facing charges linked to war crimes allegations, lost a bid for a reduced sentence.
There was a Greyhound bus crash in Tennessee. Tragically, 2 deaths reported, dozens injured.
An Iranian man pleaded guilty in the U.S. to ransomware attacks that had affected the city of Baltimore.
And Italy sent another group of rejected migrants back to Albania under their controversial agreement. About 26 people in this instance.
Wow. That is... It's a lot to take in, isn't it? Just from a couple of days, from high-stakes geopolitics to these policy impacts, industrial accidents, local clashes.
It really is. And synthesizing this range of information, your sources seem to point towards some, interconnected themes playing out globally.
Like the pressure on traditional alliances.
Definitely. That U.S.-Canada dynamic is a prime example. Pressure on established relationships.
Which, as your sources suggest, leads to shifts in security thinking. Canada looking to Europe, new kinds of conflict like the India-Pakistan drone warfare.
And we also see how deeply connected domestic policy can be. Actions inside the U.S. on student visas, university funding, they have potentially huge consequences for education and talent flow worldwide.
Yeah, the ripples spread far.
And running through several items are these persistent challenges. Industrial safety in China, public safety at large events like in Liverpool, constant issues demanding attention.
So the overall picture from your sources?
It's one of, considerable instability and unpredictability, I'd say. Political moves, conflicts, seemingly local incidents, they're often interwoven. It really underscores the need for global leaders to have a deep understanding and maybe engage in more coordinated action, though that seems harder these days.
Absolutely. And that brings us towards the end of this deep dive into the sources you provided. We've pulled out those key insights on the U.S.-Canada tensions, Canada's strategic response.
Explored the global reach of those U.S. domestic education policies.
Touched on the significant events like the China explosion, the Liverpool incident, plus that wider snapshot of global activity.
There's definitely a lot there to process.
Indeed. And maybe as a final thought for you to ponder, building on what these sources have presented, how might this increasing tendency we're seeing towards transactional diplomacy, using domestic tools like funding or visas as political leverage, how might that fundamentally change how countries interact? How stable global relationships remain?
And related to that, how might traditional allies continue to adapt? Will we see more seeking out of alternative partnerships, like Canada seems to be doing in response to the situation described in your sources?
A critical question, as you say, for anyone trying to understand this evolving global landscape.
Hmm.
Thanks so much for sharing your sources with us and allowing us to take this deep dive together. We hope this has given you a truly useful shortcut to getting informed on these really significant events.